Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into the shadows of a world that's been buried for over 3,000 years. Picture this: the cool hush of desert air brushing past your ears, the orange flicker of torchlight dancing across stone walls etched with cryptic warnings, and a long, narrow corridor ahead that seems to breathe. You're not in your room anymore. You're deep beneath the earth in a place built to be eternal. And you're not alone, because tonight we're talking about the secret life of ancient Egyptian tomb guardians, those unsung figures who watched over the dead while the living forgot they even existed. You're going to meet them, walk beside them, hear what they heard, see what they feared, maybe even smell what they smelled. Spoiler, it's mostly dust, old oil, and things that really shouldn't be decomposing. And here's your one grim reality check. You probably wouldn't survive one night doing what they did, whether it was the heat, the traps, or the occasional misstep into a wasp's nest. The tomb business wasn't exactly OSHA certified. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still with me, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your descent before dawn, the horizon just beginning to bleed pink across the jagged cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. The Valley of the Kings lies ahead, a barren wound in the landscape where wind whistles through stone and shadows keep secrets like coin in a closed fist. You feel the chill of the night holding on a bit too long, reluctant to release its grip to the harsh Egyptian sun. There are no signs, no markers for tourists. You've taken a turn off the usual paths, ducked through a gap in the rocks, crouched under a ledge, and found yourself exactly where you shouldn't be, which is precisely where ancient guardians once stood. You shuffle forward. The walls tighten around you as the slope drops, a stone hallway pressing you deeper into the earth. It's not clean. You feel it in your lungs before your boots crunch it. Centuries of sand and dust and bat droppings layered like flaky pastry. The air smells dry and sour like old scrolls left in the sun. But still, it's beautiful. The walls are alive with color. Ochre reds, lapis blues, black outlines drawn with such steady hands you wonder if they ever trembled. Gods with hawk heads, jackals, scarabs, eyes that never blink. All watching, all waiting. The ancient Egyptians didn't just build tombs, they constructed entire universes beneath the earth. A royal tomb wasn't a coffin, it was a map for the soul, guiding it through the perils of the afterlife. And just as you pause to admire a depiction of Anubis weighing the heart of a man who looks suspiciously like he regrets his life choices, a shiver runs up your spine. Because someone, somewhere, once stood where you stand now. Not a visitor, but a watcher, a tomb guardian. Their role wasn't just ceremonial. These weren't bored guards leaning on spears waiting for lunch. Guardians were specially chosen, often from priestly families, trained to know every corridor, every twist, every secret seal. They knew how to read the ancient maps, and they definitely knew where the real entrance was, hidden behind a slab of rock with a carving so subtle it would vanish in a breath of sand. Historians still argue whether these early guardians were paid servants or deeply spiritual initiates. What's clearer is that some stayed on even after death, buried near their masters, or in small shrines just outside the tombs they once protected, forever linked to the pharaohs they served. It's quiet now, save for the crunch of your own footfall and the occasional skitter of something with too many legs. The deeper you go, the colder it gets. Not freezing, but still, it bites. Like the tomb is sighing around you, slowly exhaling the breath it's held for 3 millennia. You pause at a fork in the passage. Left or right, no map. That's how it always was. Guardians memorized these turns. They knew the trick to the fake doors, the false steps that collapsed under pressure, the air shafts that doubled as escape tunnels, or, depending on which way you went, one-way traps. The most elite guardians were even trained in rudimentary engineering, so they could reset stone triggers or recurse the walls after each inspection. Their job wasn't just guarding against robbers, it was keeping the tomb sealed in both a physical and metaphysical sense. You take the left path. A mistake? Hard to say. But let's imagine for a moment you're not just a curious intruder. Let's say you're him, a tomb guardian, circa 1250 BCE, during the reign of Ramses the Great. You've just completed your inspection of KV7, his royal tomb, and you're now making your nightly sweep. Torch in one hand, staff in the other, and maybe tucked into your belt a little dried lotus blossom for luck. Your eyes scan the walls automatically. You note the faint chalk mark you left yesterday. Still there. Good. That means no one's been through. You check the alignment of the bricks along the northern corridor. Perfect. You even pause by the entrance to a hidden side chamber where the real burial artifacts are kept, not the flashy decoys up front. You touch the lintel, whisper a prayer, move on. Suddenly, a small sound. Sand shifting, you freeze, your ears strain, and then nothing. Maybe it was a mouse, maybe it was the wind, or maybe, just maybe, one of the old spirits decided to shuffle a bit in its sleep. You move on, because you have to. The tombs weren't passive places, they were engines, machines built to move souls from one plane of existence to another. You, as a guardian, are a gear in that machine. Small, but crucial. Without you, the whole system risks collapse. The Pharaoh's Ka, his life force, needs safety and quiet. You are the silence, you are the shield, and you never forget who you're guarding. Even now, in the present, as you stand there blinking in the dark, you realize you feel something. Not quite fear, more like being watched, not in a threatening way, just observed, assessed, weighed like that guy in the wall painting. You take a breath and keep walking. Somewhere behind these walls lies a king who once ruled the known world, and just outside his door, perhaps, once stood a man no one remembers. His guardian, his shadow, silent, steady. And if the stories are true, still here, still watching. You keep walking, your steps soft against stone, smoothed by centuries of forgotten footsteps. The corridor curves slightly downward, as if the tomb itself is guiding you, beckoning you deeper. This is no haphazard cave. Every inch of this structure, the slope, the angle, even the temperature, is part of an ancient design, a carefully engineered labyrinth meant to guard the body of a god king. Because that's what these tombs were. Not resting places, not simple graves. They were fortresses for the soul, built to outlast time. Your torch flickers. It barely illuminates the darkness ahead, but even that faint light reveals something staggering. Look up. The ceiling isn't just flat rock. It's painted, a deep inky blue dotted with golden stars. The Egyptians believed that tombs should mirror the heavens, and here you are, walking beneath an artificial sky, stars above and stone below. The idea was simple. Build a piece of the cosmos underground so that the soul could ascend after death. But here's the twist. It wasn't just about the afterlife. These tombs were political statements, engineering marvels, the kind of structure that said this man was important enough to command the efforts of thousands, to carve a mountain, to chisel eternity. You glance at a doorway set into the wall. Framed in carved limestone, it seems ordinary until you realize it's fake. A false door, a common feature, designed to fool intruders, confuse grave robbers, and maybe, even just maybe, offer a spiritual exit for the Pharaoh's Ka. Because yes, in true Egyptian fashion, the false door wasn't just a trick. It had sacred purpose. Historians still argue whether these doors were intended as escape routes for the soul or as symbolic feeding spots for offerings. Either way, you definitely don't want to try walking through one. Not unless you enjoy smashing your face into a 1,000-year-old slab of stone. And just past it, another passage. This one slants down at a sharper angle. That's a sign. You're getting closer to the burial chamber. Egyptian architects didn't build downward by accident. Gravity, in their mind, meant depth, and depth meant sacredness. The deeper you buried a king, the more secure his passage to the divine. You crouch slightly as the ceiling lowers. The walls close in. It's as if the tomb is squeezing you, testing whether you belong here. The sensation is a little like crawling through a giant throat, which, in a strange way, is exactly what this is. A metaphorical journey into the earth, the womb of the gods, where rebirth happens. Not your rebirth, though. That's reserved for the guy in the sarcophagus up ahead. Let's talk engineering. These tombs weren't just carved with picks and prayers. The workers, most of them skilled artisans from a village called Deir el-Medina, were essentially elite craftsmen. They had floor plans, measurement systems. Some even used plumb bobs and cubit rods. Think ancient Egyptian architects holding blueprints, adjusting columns, sighing at apprentices who brought the wrong kind of granite. The vibe was part construction site, part spiritual mission. Take KV5, for example, the massive tomb for the sons of Ramses II. For decades, archaeologists assumed it was small. Then they kept digging. Turns out it has over 120 chambers, possibly more. A honeycomb of sorrow and pride. Each chamber once housed a prince, entombed not just for royal blood, but for proximity to the Father King. You can almost hear the guardians assigned to KV5 muttering under their breath about how they got the biggest tomb on the block. Should have transferred to KV62, one might joke. Tutankhamun's place is tiny, barely a hallway. You pause by a ledge in the wall, just a dip in the rock, carved with surprising smoothness. This, you realize, was once a niche for an offering. Perhaps bread, perhaps oil, maybe beer. Guardians didn't just watch. They maintained, they swept dust, touched up paint, replaced offerings when they spoiled. A tomb wasn't a one-and-done affair. It was a living system, and they were its caretakers. And yes, it was also a paranoid system. You'll notice no windows, no way out but the way in. That was intentional. The architects feared not only robbers but time itself, so they made the passages maze-like, angled oddly, lined with limestone in some places and plain bedrock in others. It wasn't symmetrical. It wasn't even intuitive. The goal was confusion, to disorient, to trap. Some tombs even had ghost corridors, hallways that seemed important but led nowhere. They were meant to fool both the living and the dead. In fact, one tomb, KV17, belonging to Pharaoh Seti Khens, has a corridor that dives over 100 meters into the earth. But the burial chamber? That's much closer to the surface. The deep corridor was a decoy, a giant symbolic red herring. There's a fringe theory, quirky but charming, that these decoy corridors also served as spiritual obstacle courses. The soul had to find its way through confusion, just like an intruder might. Whether that's true or just a poetic afterthought, well, historians still argue. You turn a corner and find yourself in a larger chamber, the ceiling rising abruptly. It feels like a breath. Relief. This might be an antechamber, the space before the sacred. The floor here is flatter, the carvings more elaborate. On one wall, a full depiction of the Amduat, a map of the 12 hours of the night that the soul must travel, complete with flaming rivers, snake-headed gods, and boats that float through darkness. This room might have once held treasure, or just furniture. Some kings packed their tombs like divine storage units, beds, chairs, sandals, even makeup kits. Tutankhamun had boomerangs. Others preferred board games, jars of honey, and very large jars filled with, well, let's just say preserved organs and move on. You crouch by the wall, running your fingers lightly across the etched stone. The groove is shallow but precise. These weren't amateur jobs. Every wall was drawn in red ink first, like a pencil sketch, then corrected in black by a master artist before carving began. You wonder who these artisans were. Did they sign their names in secret? Did they argue over whose cobra looked more menacing? Actually, yes, sort of. In some tombs, there are tiny inscriptions, graffiti really, left by workers. Paneb was here, in so many words. Sometimes it's a name, sometimes it's a joke, sometimes it's a complaint about the heat, and occasionally a note about the quality of wine served that week. You move slowly now, your torch casting long shadows behind pillars. The tomb seems to breathe with you, in and out, an ancient lungs and limestone rhythm. The deeper you go, the older it feels, and the more you sense the intent behind every inch of it. Because that's what's so unnerving. These tombs weren't just built, they were meant. Every hallway, every trap, every wall painting was part of a plan to keep something in and everything else out, especially you. But you're already here, and now the path ahead narrows once more. The burial chamber is close, and if you're quiet, if you listen, you might just hear the faintest sound. Not a bat, not the wind, but stone shifting, like someone or something moving beyond the last sealed door. You press forward deeper into the stone throat of the tomb, where the air begins to shift, not just in temperature, but in weight. The silence here isn't ordinary. It presses in and around you, thick as wet wool, the kind of quiet that feels aware. You swallow. Your breath echoes, and you realize that the dead, at least in this place, never really leave. You're walking into their sanctuary, their sealed universe. And someone was once tasked with making sure no one did what you're doing right now. Because long before archaeologists and curious nighttime visitors with flashlights, the first tomb guardians walked these same corridors, torches in hand, hearts heavy with purpose. Their origins stretch far back, older than the New Kingdom, even older than the pyramids of Giza. In the Old Kingdom, when tombs were simpler and pharaohs still fancied themselves sun gods incarnate, there were already people assigned to guard their eternal homes. These weren't soldiers, not exactly. They weren't monks either. They were something between part priest, part caretaker, part security system with a very short life expectancy. You stop in a wide, square chamber. The walls here are bare, unfinished, a forgotten work site, maybe, or a storage room. But it's the perfect place to imagine the first guardians preparing their nightly patrol. The routines they followed, the prayers they whispered, the gear they carried. You picture a man sitting cross-legged, carefully trimming the wick of a clay lamp, muttering a spell under his breath, not to scare off intruders, but to keep himself safe. From what? That's a longer story. See, guarding a tomb wasn't a glamorous job. It wasn't even always a safe one. Grave robbers were common, and they were desperate. Often poor, sometimes even former workers on the tombs themselves. Who better to break in than the guy who helped build the place? And so the guardians had to be more than watchmen. They had to be cunning, resourceful, the kind of people who could go without sleep, recognize a misplaced stone by touch, or detect a fresh footprint in 3-week-old dust. Imagine doing that in total darkness, with only a flickering flame and a creeping sense that somewhere nearby, someone might be listening. Historians still argue whether the earliest tomb guards were full-time professionals or part-time priests rotating through shifts like divine mall cops. What we do know is that they were trusted. Many came from the artisan community of Deir el-Medina, people already embedded in the sacred machinery of death. They weren't just guarding property, they were guarding a pharaoh's soul, and for that, they were often rewarded. Kind of. They received food rations, lodging near the necropolis, occasionally a small stipend, maybe even a loaf of date bread or a jar of beer from time to time. But their real payment was something less tangible: honor. The knowledge that they stood between order and chaos, between the eternal rest of the king and the greedy hands of the living. You glance at the floor, not level, just a subtle dip near the edge of the wall, a channel worn smooth. Maybe it was once used to drain water. Or maybe, as some fringe theorists suggest, it marked a path, a narrow walkway that guardians were taught to follow in the dark, barefoot, toe to groove, a way of navigating without sight. It's not impossible. The Egyptians were experts at subtlety. Their tomb guardians were trained to listen for certain echoes, recognize the creak of pressure plates, feel the warmth of a recently opened chamber. One curious inscription found in a worker's village even refers to the art of the ear, a poetic way of saying, if you hear something you shouldn't, run. But they didn't always get to run. The truth is, tomb guarding was dangerous work. The risk wasn't just theft, it was sabotage, politics, betrayal. There were plenty of people with motives to disturb a king's rest, rival claimants, heretics, or even angry citizens protesting famine or injustice. More than one pharaoh's tomb was broken into, not for gold, but for revenge, which puts the guardian in a tough spot. Do you protect the tomb with your life? Do you report a breach, knowing it might cost you your job or your head? Or do you turn a blind eye for a few extra sacks of grain? The records are full of uncomfortable possibilities. One papyrus from the 20th dynasty, now in the British Museum, recounts the trial of tomb workers who admitted to robbing the very kings they buried. What's more chilling? Some of them were guardians. Which leads to an unnerving conclusion. The line between protector and violator was sometimes thinner than a lotus petal. Still, most took the job seriously. Very seriously. You imagine them now, stationed at the mouth of the tomb, eyes scanning the horizon as the sun slips below the cliffs. Behind them, the cool dark of the burial chambers. Ahead, only shifting sands and jackals howling into the dusk. Their job isn't to chase thieves, it's to prevent them. To stand still. Be seen. Serve as a warning. And that's when the statue started to make sense. You remember it from earlier, back near the entrance, a large stone figure, half lion, half man, facing outward with wide, unblinking eyes. It wasn't just decoration. It was an extension of the guardian's gaze, a promise, a threat, a mythological assistant, if you will. And the guardian, he walked past it each day, maybe touched its paw, maybe whispered something like, "Hold them back tonight, old friend," because he wasn't entirely alone. Beyond human helpers, the Guardians were also supported by a system, a network of hidden passages, false doors, and magical inscriptions designed to do the guarding even after the human protectors were gone. And eventually they always were. Some simply aged out, died, were buried near their posts in modest tombs of their own. Others were promoted to higher priestly roles. And a few, well, some just disappeared. Whether they left in fear or greed or worse, no one knows. But what they left behind was a legacy of vigilance, a long tradition of watching, waiting, remembering. And it's still present in the architecture, in the worn steps, in the scorch marks from oil lamps, in the deep, clawed-out grooves where wooden gates once barred the way. You run your fingers along one such groove now, still smooth, still perfect, as if the tomb is remembering him too. The man who stood here night after night, holding his torch against the dark, listening for the sound of footsteps that never should have come. And as you turn to leave the chamber, you swear you hear one, just one, just one, a step behind you. You stop, turn slowly, but there's no one there, just you, and the memory of the first guardian. The corridor ahead seems to narrow as your torchlight wanes, pressing in on both sides like a mouth that's not quite closed. You tread carefully, stepping over loose stones and patches of gritty sand, your breath catching as the air grows heavier. You can almost feel the weight of the rock above you, tons of it, layered and silent. This was never meant to be a place people return to. It was designed to seal, to vanish, and to hold. But of course, people did return. Not just the archaeologists with their brushes and journals, but others long before them. People with different intentions and people with very sharp tools. And that's where the Guardians had to get creative. Because no matter how loyal or vigilant they were, a single man with a torch couldn't always stop a team of robbers armed with chisels and desperation. So they had help. Not from soldiers, not from backup patrols, but from traps, tricks, and illusions. A whole toolbox of deception and defense baked into the very bones of the tomb. You pause at an intersection where the passage splits into two directions. One descends sharply, the other curves gently left. You squint at the ground. One path is slightly more worn, just a few millimeters smoother underfoot. But that's enough. The smoother path is the bait, the trap. Because that's what ancient Egyptian architects often did. They invited you to choose wrong. Let's start with the simplest and possibly most sinister defense, the false corridor. These were real passages that looked promising, often even decorated, sometimes wide and beautifully carved, until they ended abruptly in a flat wall or a pit. Some even doubled back on themselves, sending you in loops until your torch ran out or your nerves did. A few tombs were deliberately designed with as many as 7 fake burial chambers, all loaded with cheap grave goods to trick would-be thieves into thinking they'd hit the jackpot. And then there were the real traps. Not just the booby traps you see in adventure movies, though they did exist. The tomb of Amenemhat III, for instance, included a massive slab of quartzite weighing over 40 tons, designed to slide into place and seal the burial chamber like a cork. That wasn't just protection. That was a statement. You shall not pass. In some tombs, corridors narrowed abruptly into steep, slippery ramps, almost impossible to climb once descended. Others had hidden wells, deep shafts covered by fragile wooden planks or thin layers of rubble. Step on the wrong stone, and suddenly you're plunging into a 30-foot hole filled with jagged rocks and some very judgmental lizards. One quirky but chilling feature: a few tombs employed decoy walls made of plaster, painted to look like stone. They fooled intruders into giving up early, or worse, triggered collapses when broken through carelessly. If that sounds like overkill, remember, this was a culture that believed in eternity. If a trap lasted only 1,000 years, it was basically defective. Historians still argue whether the famous Curse of the Pharaohs had any real-world precedent in physical design or whether it was purely psychological. But there's no denying that some tombs were designed to feel cursed. Narrow passages with impossible echoes. Low ceilings that seemed to hum when the wind shifted. Paintings of gods with knives instead of hands and serpents emerging from human eyes. It was like a horror movie, but scripted in pigment and stone. You enter one such corridor now. The walls here are different, less colorful, more aggressive. A full frieze of creatures lines the left side. Some are mythological. A lion with 3 heads, a scorpion with human arms, a crocodile wearing a crown. Others are just wrong, twisted, limbs bent the wrong way, eyes where there shouldn't be any. They're not meant to be admired. They're meant to warn you. This is a place for the dead. You're trespassing. And if the guardians couldn't be here in person, these figures would do the job for them. You may be familiar with the Book of the Dead, but what you're seeing now likely comes from the Amduat, or the Book of Gates. Texts painted directly onto the tomb walls, telling the story of the soul's journey through the 12 hours of the night. They're full of terrifying creatures, rivers of fire, walls of knives, and upside-down lakes. But they weren't there to scare the pharaoh. They were there to scare everyone else. Some fringe theories even claim that these magical texts were part of a ritual security system, that the very act of reading or mispronouncing a sacred name could trigger a metaphysical curse. It sounds outlandish until you learn that Egyptian priests spent years memorizing the correct way to speak names of gods, sometimes breaking the syllables with breathing patterns only they understood. Imagine walking through a tomb and accidentally saying the wrong word. Oops, welcome to snake-faced dreamland for the rest of your afterlife. And then there's the illusion factor. You stop in your tracks. Ahead, the wall seems off. You raise your torch and move it side to side. The shadows shift strangely, and then you see it, the faintest outline of a doorway, perfectly aligned with the stone blocks around it. It's flush with the wall, barely discernible, but it's there. Hidden doors were among the most ingenious defenses, not just physical doors, but optical illusions. Panels cut along existing seams, gaps disguised with plaster and pigment. Some were set to blend with natural striations in the rock so perfectly that only someone with insider knowledge could open them. And even if you did get through, congratulations, you've just entered the Room of Confusion. That's not an official name, but it should be. Some tombs included chambers where the acoustics played tricks on your mind. Speak in one corner, and the sound echoed behind you. Whisper, and the ceiling responded. These weren't accidents. The tomb builders knew their materials, knew how sound bounced, knew how paranoia worked. Imagine a thief cracking open a chest, hearing footsteps, turning, and seeing no one. Drop the gold, run, never return. Of course, not all the defenses were meant for humans, some were for spirits. The Egyptians believed that certain protective spells inscribed on the walls could literally blind or bind malevolent beings. These weren't metaphorical. The text would command, "May your face burn when you look upon this tomb." That's not poetic license. That's the spiritual equivalent of an alarm system with a flamethrower. You crouch and study a bit of faded text. Hard to read. But one glyph stands out. A pair of eyes, crossed out with what looks like a blade. A classic symbol of warding, meant to strike blind the enemy soul. If you're reading this without going blind, congratulations. Either you're pure of heart, or it's just too faded to work anymore. Probably both. And finally, there were the simple tricks, the kind that relied not on gods or architecture, but on good old-fashioned sleight of hand. Mismarked maps, reversed inscriptions, dummy sarcophagi made of plaster and straw, even rotating stone panels like a bookshelf in a haunted mansion. In KV-34, the tomb of Thutmose III, the entrance was carved into the floor of a cliff, invisible from any normal approach. You had to know it was there, otherwise you'd walk right past it, probably while wondering why you felt oddly unwelcome. All of it, every illusion, every pit, every eerily blinking painted eye, was there to protect one thing, the peace of the dead. And the guardians, those silent figures moving through the torchlight, were its final human line of defense. You wonder how they felt, walking these corridors alone, knowing that even if the traps failed, they were expected to stand their ground, defend what lay behind the final seal, with their lives if necessary. And now, you reach a doorway, sealed once, broken now, chisel marks gouged into the stone, faint soot stains from ancient torches. Someone came through here. You take a deep breath and step inside. You duck beneath the low lintel, stepping carefully into a space that feels different. The air changes here, still stale, still heavy, but tinged with something else. Not decay, not exactly. More like age. Ancient stone, ancient sweat, and the memory of incense burned so long ago it has become part of the walls. This is no ceremonial chamber, no grand mural hall or treasure room. This is a working room, a place where someone spent their days and nights in quiet vigilance. Because while the tomb was a resting place for the dead, it was also, quite literally, a workplace for the living. This is the guardian's daily grind. You can almost see him now, leaning against the wall, wrapped in linen to fend off the desert chill that seeps into stone after sundown. He's not a priest, not a soldier. He's something in between. And contrary to what you might think, his life wasn't one long string of curses, cobra fights, and last stands against gold-hungry grave robbers. No, most of it was boring, monotonous, quiet, and strangely peaceful. He'd wake just before dusk, not with a jolt, but with a slow, familiar motion, used to the rhythm of the dark. There was no rooster crow, just the far-off howl of jackals and the subtle tremble of the stone cooling after the daytime heat. His first task? Light the torch, or more precisely, coax it back to life. Torches weren't like modern lighters, no flick and no spark. You had to feed the wick, blow gently, add a bit of resin-soaked linen. If it didn't catch, you cursed under your breath, politely, nothing too offensive, lest the gods overhear, and tried again. With light in hand, he'd begin his rounds. These weren't just patrols, they were rituals. A guardian didn't just walk the tomb, he read it. Each turn of the corridor was like a stanza in a sacred poem. He'd murmur protective verses, offer small gestures of respect to the gods painted on the walls, and sometimes leave symbolic items behind, beads, pebbles, even crushed herbs believed to ward off evil. There's a fringe theory, mildly charming, that some guardians also left scratch marks along the wall as a kind of running journal. Not hieroglyphs, just shallow lines, one per shift, like tally marks. In one tomb, a single wall was found with over 800 tiny notches. Was that someone's record? A badge of honor? Or just a bored man with a sharp rock and no one to talk to? Either way, the guardian had routines, tasks, and like all jobs, it wasn't without its dirty work. Take the bats, for example, harmless most of the time until they decided to nest right over the offering shelf. Then it became the guardian's job to gently encourage them to relocate. Some used loud clapping, others burned incense. One graffiti scribble in Deir el-Medina simply says, "Bat dung again. Smells worse than the embalmer's tent." Or consider dust control. Yes, that was real. These tombs were sealed, but not perfectly. Over time, sand seeped in, blown through vents, dragged in on sandals, or kicked up by animals. Too much dust could obscure sacred inscriptions. It was the guardian's job to sweep, sometimes with bundles of palm fronds, sometimes with linen cloth, and sometimes less successfully with just the soles of his feet. Meals were modest. Usually a simple ration of flatbread, sometimes dipped in oil or honey. A jar of beer, thick and grainy, more like porridge than something you'd chug at a party. Occasionally dried figs or lentils. Not bad, all things considered, but not exactly fit for a banquet. And sleep, that was a luxury. He couldn't sleep inside the burial chamber. That would have been sacrilege. Instead, most guardians rested in antechambers or shallow alcoves just outside the tomb's threshold. Some even built small huts nearby, shaded with woven mats. One surviving hut had fragments of a game board inside, senet, the ancient equivalent of backgammon. Clearly, even guardians needed to unwind. But their minds were never fully at ease, because tombs made noises. You wouldn't expect it, but they did. Stones settling, air shifting, the occasional skitter of a beetle, and the weirdest of all, whispers. Not literal voices, of course. But the acoustics in these chambers could produce echoes that behaved strangely. Say something in one corner and it might answer you in another. Speak a name and you might hear a rustle behind you. Imagine trying to sleep in a place like that. You roll your shoulder against the stone and glance down at the wall. Faint smudge marks. Possibly from fingers. Possibly not. Some guardians left small protective glyphs, invisible unless you knew what to look for. A miniature Eye of Horus, a wedgeat symbol, Ankh signs hidden in the cracks. They weren't for tourists, they were for the gods and for peace of mind. Historians still argue whether the guardians actually believed in the supernatural dangers of the tomb or if it was just protocol. Some evidence suggests that fear was real. At Deir el-Medina, one letter between two workers describes a night where a voice without breath was heard inside the tomb, and a worker refused to return for a week. Another recounts a flickering light seen in a sealed chamber, followed by illness. The god is displeased, the letter ends, but more often the job passed without drama. Day by day, night by night, the same patrol, the same steps, a lifetime spent in a corridor carved for someone else's eternity. You wonder briefly whether he was lonely. He must have been. Some guardians worked in pairs. Others rotated shifts with apprentices or relatives, but many were alone. Their only companions were statues, painted gods, and the faint hum of wind winding through sandstone like a distant flute. But in a strange way, that may have been enough. There was honor in silence, power in routine. These men weren't just protecting a tomb, they were maintaining a cosmic balance. If the tomb was disturbed, the king's soul might be lost. If the king's soul was lost, the sun might not rise. No pressure. And still, they did it. For years, for lifetimes. So now, standing in the remains of one such chamber, you pause. Listen. Try to hear what he heard. Not the scrape of sandals or the growl of a desert dog outside or the slow drip of water from a carved ceiling, but something deeper. The stillness of duty. The quiet pride of a job that mattered, even if no one remembers the name of the man who did it. You step back into the corridor, and behind you the darkness settles, still steady, watching. You walk slowly now, deeper into the tomb, and something shifts in the air. Not a breeze exactly, but a change in presence. The passage curves again, this time opening into a long, rectangular hall. The ceiling rises just enough to relieve that constant stooping posture, and for a moment you straighten up, stretch your shoulders, and glance around. This is a hall of records. Not in the modern sense, but in the symbolic way the Egyptians understood memory. These walls are storytelling surfaces, and the guardians who once stood watch here weren't just muscle. They were also witnesses, interpreters, scribes of silence. The wall nearest you is covered in rows of hieroglyphs, some crisp and sharp, others softened by time. Names, dates, titles, spells, line after line of carefully carved history, not for decoration, but as activation. The Egyptians believed that words had power, that to write something was to make it real, and to erase a name was to erase a soul. You reach out and hover your fingers just above the stone. You don't touch it, not out of fear, well, maybe a little, but out of respect. These aren't just markings, this was eternal documentation. And the Guardian's job, among others, was to make sure these names remained legible, to clean dust from the glyphs, to patch flakes of pigment, to brush away tiny cobwebs. Not because spiders were a problem, but because cobwebs slowly building up could cover a name, and that was unthinkable. So now imagine, you the Guardian, oil lamp in one hand, brush in the other, working your way down the wall at 3 a.m, muttering spells under your breath while jackals howl in the hills above, all to keep a name alive. And some names did live, for centuries. You notice one now outlined in a small cartouche, the oval shape that signals royalty. The paint is faded, but you can still make out the crown, the reed, the falcon. It belongs to Thutmose II, a short-reigned but significant pharaoh. You might not know him, but someone did. Someone guarded this cartouche like it was gold. Maybe more so, because gold could be melted down. Names, once gone, they stayed gone. This was the concept of Ma'at, not just justice or truth, but cosmic balance. The Tomb Guardian's job wasn't just about security. It was about maintaining Ma'at inside the tomb so that the dead could move peacefully into the afterlife and continue their role in holding up the universe. Big job. No pressure. You move along the wall, and something curious catches your eye. A smaller figure, carved low near the base, almost hidden behind a column of spells. It's not a god, not a pharaoh. It's a man in plain robes, kneeling, hands raised. You kneel slightly to get a better look. There's a name under it. Not inside a cartouche, just free-floating in hieratic script. Faster, more fluid writing than the formal hieroglyphs. Many. Historians still debate whether this was a self-portrait by a guardian or a quiet tribute by someone who worked in the tomb and wanted to be remembered discreetly. Either way, you realize what you're looking at isn't just history. It's a signature, a whisper across time. I was here. I mattered. It hits you differently, because even in death, guardians crave the same thing we all do, to not be forgotten. And yet, most of them were. When archaeologists began cataloging the Valley of the Kings in earnest, they found burial shafts near the larger tombs, modest, undecorated, often containing 2 or 3 bodies, poorly preserved. For a long time, no one paid them much attention. But now there's growing evidence these were the resting places of tomb workers and guardians, buried close to the kings they protected. Not for wealth, not for glory, just to stay near the job they'd done all their lives. Imagine choosing that. Choosing to spend eternity near a sealed door, knowing that your bones would never lie in a monument of your own, but in a dusty shaft no one would bother to carve your name on. And yet, they stayed. You stand there a while, looking at Many's tiny carving, thinking about that kind of dedication, that kind of loyalty. It's easy to romanticize, but maybe it wasn't so noble. Maybe he had nowhere else to go. Maybe he lost his family or his home, and this tomb, this deep, silent labyrinth, became the only thing that made sense. Or maybe he loved it. Maybe the hush of the stone, the rhythm of the patrol, the purpose of preserving eternity, that was enough. No noise, no markets, just memory, duty, and the slow tick of time in a place designed to defy it. You shift slightly and your foot kicks something, a lump of stone, pale against the darker floor. You bend down. It's a fragment of Shabti, one of the little figurines buried with the dead to serve them in the afterlife. This one's broken at the neck, its face worn smooth, but the outline of a tool in its tiny hands is still visible. A worker, a helper, just like the guardian. Historians often dismiss Shabti as symbolic clutter, but there's a growing theory that some Shabti were modeled after real individuals, staff members the deceased trusted. And what's more trustworthy than the man who stood guard at your tomb? Maybe Many's likeness lives in more than one place. You pocket the fragment, not as loot, just as a reminder, and step away from the wall. And suddenly, without warning, the room breathes. It's a trick of the torch, probably, a shift in pressure. Maybe the heat stirred some air from a hidden shaft, but it feels like the chamber exhales. Not threatening, not welcoming either, just aware. You're being watched again. Not by eyes exactly, but by history, by memory, by stone walls that haven't forgotten what they were built for. You lower your torch and continue. Beyond the Hall of Names, the tomb opens wider again, leading toward its innermost sanctum. The burial chamber waits, and with it perhaps the final resting place of the guardian himself. The passage grows tighter now, narrower and more deliberate. You duck your head slightly, adjusting your grip on the torch as you ease into the final descent. The walls here aren't as decorative, no murals, no stars painted on the ceiling, just raw, pale stone. Not unfinished, uninviting. This is the boundary, the transition point between sacred space and the truly forbidden, and the burial chamber lies just ahead. You've heard about these rooms before. Seen them in documentaries, maybe. Large sarcophagus in the center, carvings on every surface, walls covered in spells. It sounds grand, regal, maybe even a little cinematic. But when you enter this chamber, it's not quite what you expected. It's smaller, quieter, almost plain. But that plainness, it's intentional, because this isn't just a place for a body. It's a place where two worlds meet, the physical and the spiritual. And the guardian's presence, even now, still seems to linger in the silence. Your torch flickers as you step fully inside. You blink slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the shadows that stretch toward the corners. The sarcophagus is in the center, rectangular, massive, carved from dark granite. It rests flush against the floor, lid still sealed. Well, mostly sealed. At the far corner, a faint crack splits the stone. Not enough for a person, just enough to suggest that time or someone has been here before. But the room is otherwise untouched. Still, and unmistakably sacred. A wide band of hieroglyphs rings the sarcophagus base, protective texts, prayers, spells, names of gods, warnings. One line repeats 4 times, once on each side. I have come so that you may be whole again. It's a phrase that shows up often in tomb inscriptions. Most Egyptologists agree it's a kind of resurrection formula, meant to coax the soul of the deceased back into their body when the time was right. Others think it's a line spoken by a guardian spirit, maybe even the real tomb guardian standing watch in the afterlife, ready to reassemble the pharaoh's soul piece by piece. Historians still argue over the deeper meaning. Is it the voice of the gods, or of a humble protector? Either way, it's poetic and oddly comforting. You move carefully around the edge of the room. The walls are covered in faint etchings, the Book of Caverns maybe, or part of the Litany of Ra. These weren't just bedtime stories for the deceased. They were instruction manuals for navigating the underworld. Each image, each line of text, told the king how to face enemies, pass gates, appease divine judges, and some scholars believe the tomb guardian knew these texts almost as well as the priests did. that they'd recite them during quiet hours, not just out of piety, but because they, too, hoped the gods were listening. You pause beside a faded figure etched into the plaster, a jackal-headed god, slender and sharp-eyed. Anubis, patron of the dead, embalmer, guide, but also protector. Some believed Anubis watched over tombs through the guardians, that when a man was assigned to guard the burial chamber, he wasn't alone. Anubis walked with him, not visibly, of course, but in instinct, in courage, in the sudden chill before danger, or in the whisper of wind that guided him toward a faint scuff mark in the dust, proof that someone else had stepped where they shouldn't. And if the guardian failed, well, then Anubis would have to step in himself. You glance up at the ceiling, flat stone, unpainted, save for a single circle at its center, carved deeply like a sun disk, with rays trailing out to the corners of the room, the symbol of Ra, the solar deity. An unusual detail, especially in a burial chamber. There's a theory about that. Some believe it was added not by royal decree, but by a guardian turned devotee, a man who spent so long in the tomb, so many nights speaking to the walls and waiting in the dark, that he began to worship the sun as something even more sacred than the king buried beneath him. Not in defiance, in desperation. Because think about it, if you lived your life underground, alone, surrounded by death and stone, wouldn't the idea of sunrise start to feel like salvation? Some even say this man, never named in the records, carved the sun disk by hand over many years, working only during his off hours, that it became his secret project, his offering, his hope. Fringe theory? Maybe. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Even the guardians needed something to look forward to. And then you see it. Tucked into the far left corner of the room, almost invisible at first, a small alcove carved into the stone wall. Not a sarcophagus, not even a proper niche, just a space. Narrow, shallow, as if someone scooped out a bit of the wall by hand. Inside, a bundle of cloth, dusty, faded, half collapsed, but unmistakably human. You step closer, your breath shallow now. This wasn't a looter or a buried servant. This might have been him, the guardian, buried not in the main shaft, not far away, but here. Right in the chamber he spent his life protecting. No fanfare, no cartouche. Just a shroud, wrapped tight, tucked beside the king like a faithful dog by his master's feet. Why was he buried here? Some suggest it was a reward, a rare honor given only to those who went beyond duty. Others think it was a secret, a guardian who died unexpectedly, perhaps during a robbery attempt or a collapse. No time for transport. So the priests made a quiet decision, let him stay where he served. And then there's the romantic version, that the king himself, before dying, requested it. Let him lie beside me, he might have said, for he has kept me safe longer than any general. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. You are not alone in this room. You kneel down carefully, not to disturb, just to be present, to witness. The linen wrappings are coarse, old, but remarkably intact. You can't see the face, just the vague contour of a head, shoulders, arms folded across a still chest. You imagine his last thoughts, not of gods maybe, not of glory, just the corridor, the sound of sand crunching beneath sandals, the feel of a torch warming his hand, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. You rise slowly, brushing the dust from your knees. The room hasn't changed, the shadows haven't shifted, and yet something is different. The silence feels warmer, not welcoming, exactly, but at peace. You're ready to go. Not because you've seen enough, but because you've seen him. And now you understand. The tomb was never just for the dead. It was always watched, always guarded, and always remembered. You leave the burial chamber slowly, torchlight throwing your shadow long and thin against the wall. As you step into the next corridor, it narrows again, not in width, but in atmosphere. Something about this space feels less secure, more porous, like the boundary between worlds is thinning. Because now you're entering the part of the tomb the guardians feared most. Not for physical danger, but for spiritual exposure. This is the domain of the ritual dead. The corridor here bends sharply, 3-4 times in succession, forming a dogleg pattern. A simple feature, but deliberate, designed not to fool robbers or confound visitors. It was meant to confuse spirits, malicious ones, specifically. The ancient Egyptians believed that evil entities traveled only in straight lines, a few sharp turns, and the ghost gets lost. Outmaneuvered by geometry. Clever, right? Still, the fact that they needed this kind of design at all tells you something. There were layers of fear woven into every level of the tomb. Fear of intrusion, fear of chaos, And, perhaps most deeply, fear of the unrested dead. And that's where the guardian came in, not just as a protector of treasures, but as a warden of spirits, the living manager of a highly sensitive ecosystem of memory, soul, and ritual energy. Because these tombs weren't sterile museums. They were active sites of worship, intercession, and belief. And things didn't always go smoothly. You pause at a small doorway ahead, carved low and square, almost like a crawl space. You duck to look inside. It's a side chamber, maybe 10 feet long, empty now, save for debris. But etched onto the back wall is a striking image, a human figure, bound at the wrists and ankles, being cast out by a falcon-headed god. This is no enemy army or criminal. This is a spirit, one who's been judged unworthy. It's rare to see this image in a tomb. Most portrayals focus on the journey of the king's soul. But this is defensive art, magic designed to keep the wrong spirits out. Historians still argue whether guardians believed these spirits could truly manifest in the tomb, or if they were just metaphors. But multiple ostraca fragments of limestone used like post-it notes have been found with hastily written spells for banishment or soul pacification. Clearly, someone felt the need to write these fast, someone who may have heard something they shouldn't have. You step back and move on, eyes adjusting to the tighter space. On one wall, scratched hastily, not carved, just etched with a nail or sharp tool, you notice the phrase, "The breath is heavy tonight." Chilling, isn't it? It's not a quote from scripture. It's not in any formal style. It feels personal, like a note left by someone on shift, scribbled quickly, like an unburdening. And that phrase, you've felt it before, when the air presses harder than it should, when you know you're alone but your skin says otherwise. The Egyptians had words for this, aku, mut, ka, types of spiritual presence, some good, most not, which meant the guardians didn't just carry torches and sticks. They carried protection spells too. Often these took the form of amulets, small carved stones or faience beads worn on linen cords. The Eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, the Jed pillar. Not jewelry, not decoration. These were tools. A scratched amulet worn down from being rubbed during anxious moments is more telling than any temple mural. You reach a widening in the passage now, a small chamber just large enough to turn around in. This may have been a guard station, a designated resting point. In some tombs, these spaces were intentionally left bare so the guardian wouldn't be distracted. Just stone, air, and time. But occasionally, graffiti slips in, and here faintly you see it. Two human figures drawn side by side, one larger, holding a staff, the other smaller, seated with arms outstretched toward the first. Some say this kind of sketch represents a guardian and a ghost. Others argue it's just a father and child. But either way, it captures something quiet, intimate. Not all spirits were hostile. Some, perhaps, were lonely. And the guardian, well, maybe he talked back. You can imagine it, can't you? A long night, a flickering lamp, the echo of wind, and the whisper of a name you haven't spoken in years. So you speak it, just to remind the dead they were remembered. There's a lovely, half-forgotten tradition from Deir el Medina. On certain nights, guardians would pour out a few drops of beer or water and recite the name of someone they missed, not as prayer, not as ritual, just as memory, because memory was power. And here in the tomb, memory was protection. You continue through the corridor and the walls shift again. The plaster is rougher, the glyphs less formal. This is workers' territory, the back end of the tomb, where repairs were done, where tools were stored, where perhaps a hidden shaft was sealed. And tucked into one dusty niche is a bowl. Simple, clay, empty now, but once maybe used to burn incense or mix ochre for protective painting. The presence of it suggests something touching. The guardian may have done repairs himself, not just watched over the tomb, but tended it. A broken corner of a step, he'd patch it with plaster. A wall carving beginning to flake, he'd brush it clean. In that way, the tomb wasn't just a monument to death. It was a living environment, like a garden with no plants, just stone and shadow, waiting to be kept in balance. One quirky theory holds that some guardians developed a kind of obsessive ritual behavior, always stepping with the same foot first, always tapping the same part of the wall 3 times. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it was their way of marking time, holding onto a rhythm that no longer belonged to the outside world. Because in here, the sun didn't rise. There were no clocks, no roosters, just breath, dust, and the slow ticking of thought. You pause one last time before the corridor ends, Ahead lies another bend, another turn, but you stay here a moment longer. You close your eyes and you listen, not for spirits, not for ghosts, but for the steady, tireless footsteps of someone who once called this place home. The corridor takes a final slow curve, not sharp this time, but gentle, like the descent into a dream. You follow it without hurry, torch flickering lower now, shadows swaying like curtains on either side. The walls smooth out, no carvings here, just pale stone, unmarked, quiet. And then, without fanfare, you step into another chamber. It's unlike the others. Wider than it is long, with a low ceiling and a faint dip in the center of the floor, as though footsteps, over years, over lifetimes, have worn a shallow path in the limestone. There's no sarcophagus here, no painted gods, no books of the underworld etched into the walls, just a single rectangular bench carved from the wall itself and a shelf above it. Empty now. This is what some archaeologists call the watching room. They don't all have names, these side chambers. Some were storerooms, some were priestly rest stops. But this one shows signs of regular use. Wear marks, burn marks from oil lamps, a groove in the stone bench, smoothed by long hours of sitting. This was a place of waiting, and if the tomb had a heartbeat, it probably pulsed through here. You imagine the guardian sitting there, not patrolling, not cleaning, just listening, listening, waiting. Some nights would pass in total silence, broken only by the soft hiss of a torch or the distant stir of sand moving above. Other nights, he might have heard more. There are stories, not official ones, but tales passed down in fragments about what tomb guardians saw. Figures moving in places no one had entered, flickering lights with no flame, footsteps that matched your own, but out of sync. One guardian, centuries ago, reportedly left a small drawing behind of what he saw, on the back of a piece of pottery, found shattered near his post. A figure, tall and thin, with a jackal's head and no eyes. Historians still debate whether it was meant to be Anubis or something else. You move slowly toward the bench and lower yourself onto it. The stone is colder than you expect. Solid. Anchored. You imagine sitting here for hours, days even. Your only tasks: keep the torch lit, keep the air moving, keep your mind still. But the mind doesn't stay still in a tomb, even for a guardian. And that's where the ritual mind games began. See, a guardian wasn't just trained in walking a patrol route, he was trained in mental endurance. That's what some papyri suggest. Little clues tucked between spells and inventory lists. Let his heart be steady in shadow, one line reads. Let his ears hear only truth. Let his mouth speak only calm. Almost like mantras or training affirmations. Because staying calm in the dark with only flickering light and echoes for company, that takes practice. And that's why many guardians developed routines that went beyond duty, repeating spells, tapping walls in rhythmic patterns, tracing the same hieroglyphs with their fingers each night. A few even spoke aloud to the painted gods on the walls, like coworkers on a late shift. There's a fringe theory that some guardians kept personal companions, figurines, carved tokens, small statues they carried from post to post. Not standard shabtis, but personal talismans, like a pocket god. A spiritual comfort object. One small figure found in a sealed alcove had a falcon's head and lion's body, an odd hybrid, not recorded in official mythology. Some scholars think it was a unique protector, imagined by the guardian himself, a one-of-a-kind entity designed to watch over him, as he watched over the tomb. Makes sense, right? Even the protector needs protection sometimes. You rest your hand on the stone beside you. Cool, rough in some spots, polished in others. You wonder how many hands rested here before yours, how many sat in this exact spot, eyes scanning the dark, ears tuned for the wrong sound. The most dreaded sound? Silence. That suddenly changed, because in a tomb, consistency was comfort. You knew every crackle of the torch, every sigh of stone cooling, every drip of water from an unseen ceiling. So when one of those sounds stopped or changed, you knew something was off. And that's when the guardian would rise. Quietly. No rush. No panic. He would grip his staff, not a weapon really, just a length of polished wood, and he would walk toward the change. Was it a rat, a bat, a shifted pebble, or was it something else, something he couldn't explain? There's a recovered diary fragment from a man named Amos, possibly a low-ranking tomb attendant. On one page he wrote, "The night grew long and the shadow in the fourth corridor moved as if alive." Then, a few lines later, "I told no one. I left an offering. I have not seen it again." Just a shadow. But in a tomb, shadows mean company. You stand now, brushing dust from your robes, well, your modern equivalent, and glance around the room one last time. On the far wall, almost hidden behind a spill of dust and age, is a small painting, faded nearly to nothing. You step closer. It's a man and a flame. Just that. A single figure, hunched slightly, holding out a torch. And behind him, a great curved shape, possibly a doorway, possibly a tomb wall. No gods, no enemies, just the man and the flame. You wonder if the Guardian painted it himself, and if he did, what was he trying to say? That he held the line? That the flame was passed to him? Or that he passed it to you? There's no answer, just the image. You exhale, and the silence accepts it. You're beginning to feel the rhythm of this place now, the cycle of breath and quiet, of presence and retreat. This isn't just architecture, it's an environment built for observation. Every corridor, every alcove, every empty wall, it watches back. And for centuries, the Guardian watched in return. Until one day, he didn't. Maybe he retired, maybe he died on duty, maybe he faded into the stone, as all things here do. But part of him stayed, not just in bone or name or painted flame, but in every watchful corner, every echo that feels a beat too slow, every hush that holds its breath when you pass. You leave the room, and the flame behind you continues to burn. The corridor ahead grows tighter again, not smaller exactly, but more enclosed, like a throat narrowing before a whisper. You let your fingers brush the wall as you walk, torch lowered now to conserve oil. The air here feels different, drier, but also warmer, somehow like it's been held in place for centuries, waiting for someone to break its stillness. You've reached what scholars call the threshold zone, the tomb's psychological midpoint. You're far from the entrance, deeper than most looters ever dared go, but not quite at the tomb's heart. This is the space where two energies mingle, the divine sanctity of the burial site and the raw vulnerability of human craftsmanship. Because make no mistake, these tombs weren't dropped fully formed from heaven. They were carved, chiseled, layer by workers, by human hands. And that's who we focus on now. Not the pharaohs, not the priests, but the builders. The people whose fingerprints are still pressed into the very walls you walk beside. Some of them were artisans from Deir el Medina, a highly skilled village of tomb workers, painters, and stone cutters. Others were lower-tier laborers brought in for the heavy lifting, hauling stone, mixing plaster, managing torches. And among them, a subset of apprentices, often trained for years under the guidance of the tomb's long-term guardian. Because being a guardian wasn't just a job. It was a lineage. In some tombs, we find overlapping graffiti. Two sets of names, years apart, signed at the same post, likely father and son, or mentor and student. One would watch, the other would learn, and eventually the learner would stay behind. There's a lovely phrase scratched into a block in KV 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II. Translated loosely, it reads, "He taught me the silence, not how to carve, not how to fight, how to be still, how to listen when nothing speaks, how to watch a tomb without waking it." You walk now through a corridor still bearing those marks. In one spot, a smooth area of plaster bears the faint outline of a palm. Not a painted palm, a pressed one. As though a worker leaned against the wall for a moment, perhaps exhausted and left behind a quiet, accidental fossil. In another, a small star is scratched into the wall. Not a five-pointed modern star, but the Egyptian kind, a symbol of the night sky, of Ra's journey through darkness. No one knows who drew it, but it's the kind of mark someone makes when they're not trying to be remembered, just trying to get through the shift. Because even here, beneath layers of ritual and grandeur, fatigue was real. Workers passed out in the shade of scaffolds, fell sick from dust. Some likely died in the carving process, their names unrecorded, not buried in grand tombs, just in the earth above, the desert reclaiming them. But the guardian, he saw it all. Not just the finished tomb, but the messy middle, the chisels that broke, the arguments over pigments, the emergency patches when the plaster cracked too soon. He witnessed the daily friction of a job that had to be perfect, even though it was built by imperfect hands. And that gave him a different kind of reverence. Not the high-gloss, priestly kind, but the respect of someone who knows how much sweat lies beneath every painted ceiling. You reach a room now, a side chamber, probably storage. Inside, just fragments remain, broken jars, bits of palm rope, and something small tucked in the corner. A pottery shard, flat and curved. You pick it up, Etched into the clay are four symbols, one for fire, one for water, the eye of Horus, and a loaf of bread. Together they form a kind of blessing. May the elements guard you, may you never hunger. It's not a royal spell, it's not from a priest's scroll. This is worker magic, protective symbols for someone who had to sit in the dark, alone with only fire and faith between them and the unknown, possibly carved by a guardian, possibly left for one. Because for all the mythology, the afterlife, the divine order, there was always an undercurrent of real fear and real hope, the kind you whisper, not chant. There's an often overlooked phenomenon in Egyptian tombs: personal touches, not official offerings, but scraps of humanity. A red thumbprint beneath a mural, a bead wedged behind a statue's foot, a tiny hieratic note slipped behind a sealed panel that reads simply, "If I do not return, remember my name." And perhaps the guardian did. Perhaps that was part of the job no one ever documented, remembering the forgotten. The paint mixer who died of heat stroke, the boy who lost a hand to a falling stone, the torchbearer who dropped his lamp and never got another chance. The guardian was a custodian not just of royalty, but of all their ghosts. You pause now and glance at the torch in your hand. It's sputtering slightly. Time to trim it. You stop, kneel, adjust the linen wrap, and feed it a little oil from a small jar in your pack. The flame steadies. And in that moment, you understand something quietly profound. This was the rhythm of the guardian's life. Trim. Watch. Walk. Remember. Trim. Watch. Remember. Every night, every corridor, every breath. And he wasn't doing it for glory. He was doing it because someone had to. Because kings deserved eternity, yes, but so did the men who gave it to them. You rise again and step forward. Ahead lies the tomb's next threshold, a false door, a place the dead were meant to pass through, and beyond it, perhaps a memory no one wrote down. You stand before it now, a false door, carved into the wall as if it might open, though it never could. It's not even recessed, just a flat surface etched with the illusion of a doorway, a lintel, a pair of tall, narrow leaves, even a carved bolt, frozen forever mid-slide. The Egyptians loved these, because to them, doors didn't need hinges to work. They were passageways for the soul, not the body. The Ka, the life force, was believed to move through symbolic spaces. If you gave it a door, even a fake one, it knew where to go. You step closer. The hieroglyphs here are especially sharp, maybe retouched later by a priest or even the guardian himself. There's the name of the king, of course, and a string of titles long enough to make your tongue stumble. Then, smaller, more modest inscriptions, offerings listed line by line. Bread, beer, incense, cool water, 1,000 of each, because you can never have too much in the afterlife. But just beneath all that, nearly invisible in the flicker of your torch, are smaller symbols, really small, scratched in with a finer tool, less ceremonial, a name, not the king's, not a god's, a worker's name, Mekut, no titles, no flourish, just a name, and next to it another word, watches. Mekut watches. Who was he? Another guardian, a painter, a man who snuck in this private prayer beneath the majesty of Pharaoh's claim? Maybe this was his door too. Historians still argue whether these tiny inscriptions were acts of reverence or rebellion. Some say they're graffiti. Others see them as signatures, evidence that the tomb, though made for kings, belonged also to those who built it. You let your torchlight linger on Mekut's name a moment longer. The wall feels warmer here, like it's held the memory of that small act for thousands of years, just waiting to share it. And now you're part of it too. You run your hand across the door's edge, not to open it, just to feel its weight. This was the spot where the guardian might have paused at the start of every shift. A quick touch, a whispered greeting, maybe even a silent request for strength. And on difficult nights, of which there must have been many, he might have leaned his head against it and said nothing at all. Because this wasn't just architecture. It was ritualized space, a point of orientation, a spiritual compass, a reminder that this wasn't just a stone room in a hill, it was the threshold to eternity, and someone had to keep that threshold steady. You move past the door and deeper into the next corridor. This one's different, shorter, tighter, angled slightly downward, like the tomb is drawing you in with intention now. You're not wandering anymore. You're being led. You feel it in your spine. This is where the tomb's emotional gravity begins to build again, where the guardian's duties took on their most intimate shape. Because beyond this corridor lies the offering chapel, Not the grand temple kind, full of pillars and priestly rituals. This is private, internal, a space tucked deep inside the tomb where offerings to the dead were made, sometimes by priests, sometimes by relatives, and sometimes by the guardian alone. Imagine him kneeling here, back straight, head bowed, holding a tray with a few crusts of bread and a tiny cup of beer. Not much, but enough. Enough to keep the king's spirit whole. Enough to maintain the balance. You step into the chapel now. It's quiet, quieter than even the burial chamber. The walls here aren't decorated like before. Instead, they're smooth to a polished sheen, reflecting just a hint of your torchlight. There's an offering table in the center, stone, of course. Simple, low to the ground. The top is grooved with narrow channels to catch the liquid from libations, wine, milk, water, so it wouldn't spill on the floor. And carved into the side is a short inscription. Not a spell, not a threat. Just 4 words. He gave and stayed. It's not attributed to anyone. It's not grand, but it says everything. He didn't just give offerings, he stayed. In the dark, in the dust, long after everyone else left. He stayed. It's in this room that the guardian may have done his most sacred work. Not in fighting robbers, not in walking endless patrols, but in kneeling, offering, whispering the name of the king into the hush. There's a practice mentioned in one of the more obscure funerary texts, the naming of the light. A guardian would be tasked with lighting a flame beside the king's name and saying it aloud. Not once, but 7 times, each time slightly softer than the last, until the 7th became a whisper, indistinguishable from silence. They believed it strengthened the soul, like watering a plant or feeding a flame. You try it now, just once. You speak the king's name, whatever name you choose in this moment, and let it settle in the air. The walls don't answer, but they feel quieter now, as though they've acknowledged your presence. On one of the side shelves, half buried in dust, you spot something unexpected. A feather. Small, pale, perfectly intact. How it got here, who knows? A bird couldn't survive in this tomb, not for long. Maybe it drifted in on the back of someone's robe. Maybe it was placed here deliberately as a symbol. The Egyptians associated feathers with Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. Her feather was used in the weighing of the heart ceremony, set on one side of the scale, your soul on the other. Too heavy and you were devoured by Amit, just right, and you moved on to paradise. Perhaps the feather was left here as a reminder to the guardian. Balance matters, in life, in duty, in silence. You leave it where it is. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. You back away from the offering table, letting your torch cast one final glow across the smooth floor. No footprints here, just the memory of footsteps, just the idea that someone once knelt exactly where you stand now and whispered the same kind of gratitude. And maybe, just maybe, that whisper is still echoing, soft, faint, unfinished. The corridor beyond the offering chapel narrows again, but this time it feels different. Not claustrophobic, but intimate. You walk slowly, torch held low, the light licking gently across the limestone walls. Your steps seem to grow quieter here, as if the very air is cushioning your presence. You're moving now into a space that wasn't meant for ceremony or grandeur, but for living. Not the living in the outside world, but the daily existence of the guardian himself. This was his habitation zone, his shelter, his cell, his strange little home beneath the earth. The Egyptian tomb guardian was never meant to be ornamental. He wasn't a relic, he was functional. He lived here, slept here, ate here, swept sand from the thresholds and soot from the walls. And if this tomb was the kingdom of the dead, then he was its last remaining subject. The room you enter now is barely more than a hollow. No decoration, no symbols. But you recognize the signs immediately. A flattened area where bedding once lay. A blackened patch in the corner where a cooking flame might have flickered. A niche carved into the wall, shallow and empty now, but likely once home to a few precious possessions. A lamp, a cup, a small figurine. This is his room. And it's humbling. Because for all the divine art and royal extravagance in the chambers you've already passed, this place feels most human. You can picture it, a thin mat, maybe stuffed with reeds, a small pile of belongings wrapped in linen, a wooden stick propped near the door, not as a weapon, but maybe just so he had something to hold while thinking. There's a gentle sadness in this space, not sorrow, but a kind of resigned simplicity. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, but he was trusted. And in a world like ancient Egypt, where eternal life was everything, being trusted to guard a tomb was no small honor. There are stories of guardians who never left, not because they were imprisoned, but because they chose to stay. Even after their shift ended, even after a replacement arrived, they refused to rejoin the surface world. They'd become part of the tomb. In some ways, it was easier. No taxes, no sunburn, no arguments at the market, just structure, purpose, silence. One text mentions a man named Becket, assigned to the tomb of a lesser noble. His service was only meant to last 3 years, but when they came to relieve him, he declined. He said, "The house above has no peace, but here I remember what matters." And they let him stay. There's evidence in the workers' village of guardians who slowly lost their taste for the outside. Their homes grew dusty, letters went unanswered. Eventually, they became names in a ledger, crossed out quietly, no ceremony. It makes you wonder, what did they think about day after day, alone beneath the sand? Maybe they recited prayers, maybe they paced, maybe they talked to the dead. Not out of madness, but out of routine. Some probably kept journals, though few survive. One sliver of papyrus found in a collapsed storage space near KV9 contains a single repeated line, "I am the mouth of the tomb." Over and over, more than 50 times. Was it a mantra? Was it a claim? Or was it simply the only thing the writer felt certain of? You move through the rest of the room slowly. There's a second niche, higher up, and in it something odd. A doll, not a child's toy, though it resembles one. Carved from a single piece of wood, arms folded, blank face, no eyes. It's not a ushabti. It lacks the formal markings. This is something else. Scholars argue over the meaning of these figures. Some say they were companions, imaginary friends for a life lived mostly in silence. Others say they were surrogate watchers, stand-ins for the guardian during his rest hours. He'd place it in the passageway, facing outward like a second set of eyes. Superstition? Maybe. But practical, because the tomb never slept, and neither could he, not fully. You step back into the corridor now, leaving his quarters behind. Ahead, a small flight of steps leads downward. Not steep, just a gentle slope carved into the bedrock. And then you reach what might be the oddest room yet. It's round. Not perfectly, a rough oval, really, but the effect is striking. A tomb of lines and corners suddenly gives way to curve. And in the center of the space, nothing. Just bare floor. Some archaeologists suggest these rooms were used for listening. Their shape enhanced acoustics, allowing the guardian to detect faint sounds, footsteps, loose stones, the whisper of air moving where it shouldn't. It's also possible the room was used for meditation, a private chapel of sorts, a space where the guardian could recite protective incantations or renew his own resolve. One fringe theory even suggests that these rooms acted as emotional drains, that walking the tomb filled the guardian with fear, tension, alertness, and here, in the circle, he could let it go, speak a name, clap his hands, whisper into the void, and leave it there. You sit in the center of the room now, cross-legged, the torch resting on a stone nearby. You try it yourself. Not a spell, not a prayer, just a breath. In, out, in, out. And in that moment, the tomb doesn't feel haunted or heavy or strange. It feels still, supported, as though the guardian isn't gone, but just stepped out for a moment, trusting you to hold the space in his absence. You rise slowly, retrieve your torch, and exit the circle. There's only one corridor ahead, and it leads toward the innermost sanctum of the tomb, a place where rituals once ended, where echoes were meant to sleep. But before you go, you glance back one last time, back at the round chamber, back at the guardian's small room, back at the empty niches, and you understand something now, fully and finally. This was never just about guarding a tomb. It was about becoming the tomb, living in its quiet, serving its silence, and eventually joining it. The final corridor awaits, longer than it looks, with a strange slope that fools your sense of gravity. As you move forward, the walls seem to narrow and then breathe out again, as if the tomb itself is preparing for some quiet revelation. Your footsteps echo here, not loudly, but sharply, like they're walking beside you. And maybe they are, because you're heading toward the burial chamber, but not the main one. Not the grand, gilded vault you might expect, where sarcophagi lie beneath painted ceilings. That chamber you passed long ago. This is something different, a hidden sanctum, used not for royal sleep, but for the guardian's final purpose. This was the ritual core. You step inside. It's a low room, maybe 12 feet across, with a domed ceiling and a basin carved into the center of the floor. No paint, no inscriptions, but the shape of the space, the feel of the air, it tells you this was special. This is where the Guardian came to reenact the king's rebirth. Every so often, on certain holy days, during eclipses, after floods, he would descend here alone and perform the rites again. Not because anyone told him to, but because eternity wasn't automatic. It needed maintenance. It needed renewal. He would light incense, pour water into the basin, speak the king's name aloud, and walk a tight circle around the edge of the room, 3 times, maybe 4. There's a faint groove in the floor to prove it, footsteps worn deep over centuries of circling. Historians still argue whether this was official doctrine or a personal adaptation. But the physical evidence, the wear, the soot, the remains of oil jars, suggest this ritual was no one-time thing. It happened often, and always in solitude. The guardian became the priest, the witness, the only living person on earth still doing the work. It's easy to romanticize that, but think of what it cost. Isolation, repetition, a life defined not by change, but by preservation. You weren't allowed to forget. You weren't allowed to rest. You had to hold the world in place, even as yours slowly disappeared. The tomb may have been silent, but the guardian's mind, never. You imagine him kneeling here, hands stained with oil and soot, reciting the opening of the mouth ceremony, not just for the king's statue, but perhaps for himself, to keep his own soul animated, to prevent his thoughts from growing brittle with dust. And you wonder, who watched him? Who remembered his name? Because in all the rolls of papyri, all the ornate inscriptions, we have shockingly few names of tomb guardians. They were present in every burial, every construction plan, but their identities often lost, like the unnamed soul. There's a legend told in whispers pieced together from 4 tomb sites across the valley. It speaks of a guardian whose name was deliberately erased, not by enemies, but by decree, for reasons no one can fully agree on. Some say he defiled a sacred object. Others say he fell in love with a priestess. One version claims he allowed a foreigner to step into the tomb, not knowing they were sick, and the presence cursed the chamber for years. Whatever the reason, his name was scrubbed from the walls, his personal effects removed, his likeness destroyed. But here's the strange part. In the years that followed, someone kept performing the rituals. Oil still appeared near the basin. Libations still wet the offering stones. The walk around the room continued, grooves deepening, soot collecting, long after his name vanished. So either the rituals performed themselves, or the guardian never stopped. He just did it nameless. And there's a kind of terrible beauty in that. To continue serving even after the world erased you. To move in the dark without thanks, without audience, to whisper the name of another while yours is forgotten. You circle the basin once now, just once, slowly. Not to perform the ritual, just to understand it. The air feels denser near the center, still breathable, but thicker somehow, as if the tomb is listening again, as if it always has been. In the far corner of the room, you spot something small, a scrap of linen caught in a crack in the floor. You kneel to look closer. It's old, beyond old. The fibers crumble at the edges, but on its surface, faded and shaky, is a line of hieratic script, not a spell, not a record, just a line from a song. Roughly translated, it reads, "Light has left, but I remain." You don't need to know the melody. The words are enough. The guardian, in all likelihood, didn't see himself as a hero. He wasn't there to be worshipped. He was there to stay, to keep the light, even if it wasn't his own. You place the scrap back where it was, let it rest. There's nothing more to do in this room. But before you turn to leave, you look once more at the groove in the floor, the circle, the echo of footsteps that never sought fame, never expected thanks, just presence, just care. And just like that, the basin room exhales and you walk on. The corridor that follows is unlike the others, not because of how it looks. No, it's still carved limestone, still silent, still tapering ever so slightly as if coaxing you forward rather than commanding it. What makes this passage different is what it feels like. You're not going deeper now. You're not descending. You're returning, but slower, softer. Because before the guardian left the tomb, whenever that time came, if it came at all, there was one last place he always paused. A chamber not marked on royal maps, not described in priestly scrolls. The memory room, that's what modern Egyptologists sometimes call it. But no one knows its real name. You enter it now, It's not large and it's not ornate. But what strikes you immediately is the texture of the walls. They're carved not with gods or kings, but with scenes of daily life: a farmer and his oxen, a woman grinding grain, a scribe hunched over his scrolls, a child reaching for a fig. And unlike the formal symmetrical murals from earlier, these are irregular, as though each image was added slowly over time. Some crude, some beautiful, all full of life. This wasn't official tomb art. This was personal. This was the Guardian's gallery. Maybe not carved by him, but curated, selected, remembered. Over the years, whenever a worker passed through with a chisel and a story, they left it here, a snapshot of something they loved, something they missed. One wall bears a series of footprints, bare, side by side, carved small into the stone. Underneath is a single word: together. Were they a couple, a family, or simply friends who shared a shift and wanted to be remembered as one? You walk slowly along the wall, your torch catching on each tiny vignette. Here, a cat curled in the sun. There, a fish leaping from a painted pond. One particularly detailed scene shows a market vendor balancing grapes on her head and laughing. The lines of her smile are deeply cut. Someone cared about that smile, and it hits you. The Guardian didn't just protect the tomb, he protected these memories, the ones that wouldn't make it into the afterlife scrolls, the ones that weren't gilded or sung about by choirs, but the ones that made life worth living. This was his treasure. Not gold, not spells, but the echoes of normalcy: a simple day, a warm laugh, a loaf shared, a sunlit walk. Historians still debate whether this room was sanctioned by royal decree or built in secret. Some argue it couldn't have existed. It breaks too many rules of tomb symmetry, religious protocol. But it's real. It was carved, and someone cleaned it, cared for it, watched it. The paint on one wall is fresher than the rest, still faded but less so, suggesting the Guardian may have touched it up over the years, or maybe in his last years he added something new. You find it tucked in a low corner, just above the floor. A simple image, a man and a flame. Again, we've seen him before, but now the flame is passed to a second figure, smaller, younger. It's a transfer, a legacy. We don't know if tomb guardians were formally succeeded. There's no manual, no appointment record, but the evidence suggests they trained others, apprentices, replacements, maybe even family. And this wall, the whole room, feels like part of that training. A message: don't forget what matters. A final lesson, not in defense, but in memory. You sit on a low stone shelf at the back of the room and rest your torch nearby. For a moment, you just breathe. You feel the weight of the stories around you, not heavy, just anchored. There's something comforting about this room, more than any chamber you've passed, more than the burial vaults or offering halls, because this one says, you're allowed to remember. You're allowed to miss things. You're allowed to hold onto pieces of your life, even when the world above moves on. One inscription on the ceiling reads, "What I kept was not gold, but hours." You wonder what hours he meant. A sunrise once glimpsed on the cliffs before entering the tomb, the feel of his child's hand in his just before descending for his shift, the first sip of cool beer after surviving a dust storm. Small moments, heavy with light. He guarded them all. You rise now, slowly, because there's just one last stop ahead, a stairway that leads at last toward the light. You'll leave the tomb soon, but the tomb won't leave you, not entirely, not after this. You glance one last time at the wall of daily scenes: a cat, a loaf, a laugh, a flame passed on, and you carry them with you, step by step, back into the dust, back toward the surface. The stairway rises before you, carved with a gentle slope, steep enough to lift you, but kind enough to let you pause. And you do, because something shifts here. The air grows lighter, not exactly fresh, but tinged with memory of movement. Sand, distant sun, a reminder that you are finally nearing the threshold between worlds. The Guardian, too, would have known this spot well. It was here, just beneath the surface, that he paused before stepping back into life, or before stepping down, back into silence. And sometimes he may not have stepped out at all. Some guardians, those with no families left or no desire to return to the noise above, chose to end their days here, in the tomb, quietly, without announcement. Their bodies discovered only years later, tucked respectfully inside niches, wrapped in linen, clutching tokens of devotion, not royalty, not mummified, but remembered. The tomb took them in, because when you guard the dead long enough, eventually they guard you. You climb now, step by slow step, and even as the light above grows stronger, the tomb does not release you quickly. The slope winds gently, offering one final corridor, a shadow hall as it's called in some texts, not part of the tomb's main design, not meant for burial or offerings. This was a place for the guardian's last acts, an in-between space, a liminal zone. Here he performed final checks, tended final flames, whispered final words. There's soot on the ceiling, marks on the floor from years of pacing, and on one wall, a surprise. A mirror, not a glass one, of course, just a polished sheet of copper, still faintly reflective. It wasn't for vanity, it was for self-reckoning. Before he returned to the surface, the guardian would look at himself, just for a moment, not to admire, but to ask, am I still whole? Did I keep the balance? Did I forget anything? You try it yourself. Your torchlight bounces off the surface, faint, distorted. But there you are, tired eyes, dusty skin, a reflection shaped more by presence than perfection. It's enough. You turn, you climb the last few steps, and then the sky. Not all at once, just a shard of it, framed by stone high above. But it's enough to make you pause, because this light feels like something earned. You ascend slowly, and as your head clears the threshold, you see it, the desert, endless, blinding, beautiful. The cliffs behind you, golden in the low sun. The wind, light and dry, catching your hair, tugging at your clothes. You hear nothing now but wind and sand and the faint call of a bird somewhere far off. The tomb is below you, still, waiting. You turn back and look down the stair, just once, and you whisper something, anything. Maybe a name, maybe thanks, maybe nothing at all. Because some goodbyes don't need words, they need silence. You walk away now up the last rise of rock that across the stone platform once used by priests and porters and builders alike. And in the distance, the Nile, still flowing, still dividing the worlds of the living and the dead, still carrying stories, yours perhaps among them. So now, as the desert wind drifts behind you and the echoes of the tomb fall still, your breath begins to slow. The world above may be brighter, louder, more chaotic, but the hush of the guardian's world lingers, folding gently around you like linen on stone. You let your mind wander back through the chambers, past the circle of worn footsteps, the tiny paintings, the smooth stone bench and the shelf above it, each room a memory held in perfect stillness, waiting centuries just for you to notice. There's no hurry now, no more corridors to explore, no more flame to tend. You've kept the watch. You've passed through shadows and stories, and the tomb has whispered its truths to you. And maybe, just maybe, the guardian is still there, in silence, in stone, in the soft warmth of memory. So if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. If your thoughts drift, let them wander. There's no lock on this tomb, no need to guard it anymore. It's safe. You're safe. You carry it with you. The patience, the care, the quiet. Let it settle in your chest like cool air in deep stone. Let it keep you still. And as sleep begins to fold around you, slow and soft and silent, just remember, he stayed and now you rest.